Okay, so I'm Zach Kaplan, and I'm going to be talking about structured analytic techniques, which I know is the most thrilling topic in the world. My PowerPoint, I have them printed off, and that's what you guys have in front of you. The reason I have that is because that's just kind of like a summary of all the stuff. I'm not actually going to be reading from the slides, so if you want to give the slides like a brief overview and take any notes on what I say, because there's some that Professor Kachil and I have talked about that are a little more important that I'm going to be going into in a little more depth. So the first general category, there's a general category and then there's specific strategies within it. So the first one is decomposition and visualization. Like I said, everything on the slides is not what I'm going to read, so you can give that a read. But I want to talk about the getting started checklist first. So for all of these, I want to talk about kind of when to use it, the value added to the project, and the method, not the full method because obviously they're very in-depth, but kind of the general method. And if you have your book, The Cases in Intelligence Analysis, on XXIV, there's this chart. It shows all of the strategies, all the techniques, and the cases in the book, it shows which techniques they use in that case. And then the rest of the information about the specific cases I got from Structured Analytic Techniques for Intelligence Analysis, and those are my two sources. So for the Getting Started checklist, when to use it, this one, as you can tell from the name, it's an automatic first step in preparing an analysis and protection against unwanted surprises through the research. So obviously you can get off the right foot. So the value added, it saves analysts a lot of time of having to change course later on. And it's important to note that sometimes changing course is going to be inevitable, so you're going to have to do it. But when you use a Get Started checklist, it can avoid doing that as often as possible. And it does save a lot of time, so you set it out, you're prepared, you know what you have to do. And then the method is you answer several questions at the beginning of a project, such as what prompted the analysis, what is the key intelligence, policy, or business question that needs answered by your research. The next is chronologies and timelines. So when to use that, whenever it is important to understand the timing and sequence of relevant events or to identify key events or potentially gaps in those events. So you lay everything out. This one is going to be used a lot because obviously whenever you're doing this kind of research, you're going to need to know a lot about key events. So the value added, it can aid in the identification of patterns and correlation among specific events, and it allows you to relate seemingly disconnected things to the big picture. So obviously, if you just think about two separate things, you're not really going to connect that, but if you lay it out on a timeline, you might be able to make more of a connection to that. So the method to use this, you can use an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document to log the results of your research, and you can make sure that relevant information is listed with the date it occurred, or kind of like when it happened, where it happened, and make sure that's all laid out. The mind map is one of the ones that's not as important for us, but it's something I'm still going to mention at least one thing about all of these. So the mind map has two basic elements. There are ideas that are judged whether or not they are relevant to the topic, and then there are lines that show and describe these connections. So the next general category is idea generation, and the first technique within idea generation is structured brainstorming, which is one that we're going to be using. So when to use it at the beginning of a project to identify a list of relevant variables, key driving factors, a full range of alternative hypotheses, key players or stakeholders, potential solutions, or any factors that may come into play. So the value added, the creativity comes from two or more analysts. It's not just one analyst looking down at looking at a problem and coming up with their own explanation. It's more people, and they have a greater idea, a greater range of ideas and perspectives that they could not do on their own. So the method is the leader of the group presents focal questions. They explain what's going to happen in the meeting. They make sure they enforce the ground rules. They keep the meeting on track by asking relevant questions often, and they stimulate the discussion. And they record all ideas and summarize the key findings. So you're going to have one kind of mediator, I guess, that's going to lead the meeting so that you don't get off topic, and they're going to ask questions to make sure that it doesn't funnel in. This kind of thing can really avoid things like groupthink, which is, if you've been in Dr. Grossman's classes, or if you haven't, you're going to learn about it eventually. Groupthink is one of the worst things that can happen in politics, especially in the intelligence community. It can lead to things that are obviously very detrimental. So the method, or I already talked about the method. So the next one is starbursting, another one that we're going to be using a lot. So when to use it? It helps define the research project, identifies the questions that need to be answered by the research. So whereas the brainstorming are kind of coming up with ideas, starbursting is actually coming up with the questions that need to be answered at the beginning. So the value is, if you don't really ask the right questions, then there's no way to find the right answers. So if you're asking the wrong questions, you're going to find wrong research and you're going to be way off track. So the method is, it's called starbursting because you kind of want to create a 6-point star as like your diagram. And each word has its own point: who, what, how, when, where, and why. And you want to label these at each point of the star, and at the brainstorming session, you use each of these words at a time, and you help generate questions about the topic. So you start with the who, you answer, come up with ideas, and have a whole session on that, and come up with a bunch of questions, and then you move on to the next word. So at the end, you're going to have a bunch of questions spurring off of the one-word questions, if that makes sense. The next one is morphological analysis. So it's useful for dealing with complex, non-quantifiable problems with little data available. So this one is not quite as important because basically when you use it, you know you're going to have a surprise. You know it's pretty much the analysis you use when you don't know a lot, when you don't have a lot of information. So this one is a lot of guesswork, which is why it's not used that often.
Does anyone know what a WAG is? This has a sad propensity to create WAGs.
So the next is classic quadrant crunching. You use key assumptions and their outcomes to determine alternative outcomes. So you're looking at one outcome and you kind of force yourself to look at all the other possible alternatives. So the one example is many different ways that a terrorist might attack a water supply. So even though all the analysts are saying this is how they're going to do it, we know this is how they're going to do it because this is how they've done it many other times, you then look outside of that and think, okay, well this is another way they could do it. They never have, but they could. And then foresight quadrant crunching is used to develop a comprehensive set of alternative scenarios. So kind of the same idea, but a little different. An example of this is how the conflict in Syria could evolve in future years. So it's not so much one single event, it's you're looking at a specific conflict or occurrence and how that might continue in the future and how you think it's going to continue. So the next broad category is scenarios and indicators, with the first one being simple scenarios. So when to use it? It's most useful when a situation is complex or when the outcomes are too uncertain to trust just a single prediction. So it's kind of the opposite of what its name is. When the information is very complex, you're trying to simplify it and you want to use the simple scenarios to try and come up with many different outcomes. So the value added, it's analysts thinking about many possible scenarios, and basically what they're saying, how the book described it, as they're rehearsing for the future so they can be prepared. So instead of estimating and being wrong, they provide a framework for considering multiple futures, and then they kind of look back on how that can become a reality. So the method is you define the issue and the specific goals, you make a list of forces, factors, and events that are likely to influence the future, you organize them into groups, you label them, and you write a description of each group, and then you generate the many different scenarios. The next is the multiple scenarios generation. So it adopts a different approach to generating scenarios by flipping the assumptions and looking at the scenarios from the opposite perspective. So if you're looking at it from a CIA perspective and you're dealing with the situation in Syria, you look at it how the Syrian intelligence might look at that to kind of predict how that might go if that was happening to you. So the next is indicators. When to use it? It provides an objective baseline for tracking events, and it strengthens the analytic process and enhances the credibility of the final process. So basically you're using these to try and strengthen your own intelligence. So the value added, it creates an awareness that prepares the mind to recognize early signs of change. So you're using these not only to create a research project or some intelligence, what you really want to do is predict change before it happens. So you can say, okay, well we know this is an indicator that this thing is going to escalate at this time and we need to be prepared for that, rather than just saying, okay, well this is our plan and we'll deal with it when we come to it. Because obviously in the intelligence community, there's going to be a lot of change, there's going to be a lot of things you're not prepared for, but you need to try and prepare yourself as much as possible, and that's what indicators do. So the method is you create a list of the indicators, you review and refine that list to the ones that you think are more likely. You examine each indicator and you determine if it meets the 5 criteria, which is observable, collectible, valid, reliable, stable, and unique. Observable and collectible are one. I can't count, I promise. But if it meets all those 5 criteria, you make it into a final list, and that's when you kind of research those more to see if they could indicate some type of change. So indicators validation. So it's a process that helps analysts assess the diagnostic power of an indicator. So it's kind of just a step forward from the indicators technique, where it's just validating that those indicators really do matter and they really are going to create some type of change. So the next category is hypothesis generation and testing. The first technique within that is simple hypotheses. It's the easiest to use, but it's not always the best. It's basically used as a basis for developing scenarios. So it is what it sounds. You come up with a hypothesis that you think might happen, and you present that to analysts or your superior or whatever, a group. So it's easy, but again, it's not always the best. So spurring off of that is multiple hypotheses generator. So when to use it, you use it as a technique for developing multiple alternatives for explaining a particular issue. So as opposed to a simple hypothesis where you're just creating one scenario, you have a group of people that are creating multiple hypotheses. So the value added, it can give greater confidence than other techniques where an alternative or an outlier has not been overlooked. So if you're just creating one hypothesis, you're going to overlook a lot of things. You're not going to think about all the variables, you're just going to think about the variables in your hypothesis. So this kind of breaks that up. So the method, you define the issue, activity, or behavior that you want to examine. You break up the lead hypothesis, so the big overall hypothesis, or the simple hypothesis, into its component parts of who, what, how, when, where, and why. And then you review the list of alternatives. You resort them from most credible to least credible. And then you select from the top of the list the hypotheses deserving the most attention. So it's not that the other hypotheses aren't good. It's just that the ones at the top of the list have the most research behind them, have the most variables that can actually be tested, and can create the most solid research. So the next is the quadrant hypothesis generation. So this is used to identify a set of hypotheses when the outcome is likely to be determined by 2 driving forces. So it's specifically when 2 things are going to affect one hypothesis. Next is analysis of competing hypotheses. So when to use it, it's appropriate for almost any analysis where there are alternative explanations for what has happened, is happening, or is likely to happen. So this can obviously be used a lot considering its past, present, and future. So you're going to study what has happened and how it might impact what is happening or what you think might happen in the future. So the value added, it improves the analyst's chances of overcoming challenges of incomplete information or ambiguity by requiring the analyst to identify and refute as many reasonable hypotheses as possible. So it's, again, kind of like the multiple hypotheses generator, but it's another step to where you're taking those top list hypotheses and you're eliminating the ones that are either incomplete or you're improving them by gaining more information and making sure they're not so ambiguous. And the method is you identify the hypotheses, you make a list of significant information, you create a matrix with all of the hypotheses, so kind of like starbursting. You can use that general shape. I'm sure you can use whatever shape you want, but also depends how many you have. So you review where analysts differ in their assessments. So many analysts look at the same hypotheses, and then you refine the matrix based off of whether or not the analysts agree, disagree, or what information can come up, and then you draw tentative conclusions about the relative likelihood of each hypothesis. And then you're going to do the same thing as you do in the multiple hypotheses generator, where you create a list and select the top ones. And then the last is deception detection. So this is basically very, very important because whenever you're dealing with intelligence, it has to be discussed because there could always be deception by either a foreign intelligence service or other adversary organization. And that's one thing that every analyst needs to consider, that the information you're getting, even though it might be from a country, another country's intelligence community, they could be lying to you, or they could be trying to throw you off depending on whether or not this information makes them look good, bad, or they just don't want you to have it. So it's something that every analyst has to consider when researching. So the next category is assessment of cause and effect. And the first one is key assumptions check. So when to use it, when evidence is incomplete or ambiguous, it has to be interpreted to estimate future developments. So So the value added, it identifies specific assumptions. You can achieve a better understanding of the dynamics. You gain a better perspective. You can discover hidden relationships between another country or more organizations or companies. You can identify any developments that would cause an assumption to be abandoned. So if you find new information and it basically disputes your assessment, you can throw that out the window. And you can avoid surprises of new information. So obviously it's another thing, you're just researching more to make sure. A lot of these techniques are basically to avoid surprises, because the last thing you want in the intelligence community, you know you're going to have surprises, but you want to limit them so you're prepared. And the method of key assumptions check is you gather a small group of individuals working on an issue. They all bring a list of the assumptions they have about this issue. You identify the list of assumptions and you critically examine each one to make sure it can't be disputed. You then refine the list based off the ones maybe two people agree. You can combine an assumption, or if you find information disputing it, you can throw it out. And then you consider whether uncertainty should be converted into intelligence collection. So it's basically where you decide if it is important enough to actually begin that collection. The next is the red hat analysis. It's a technique for trying to perceive threats and opportunities as others see them. So the positives to this is it can help you understand the behavior of other people. So whether it be a foreign leader, group, organization, or country, you kind of get into their mind and you see how they think to try and better understand them. The next is outside-in thinking. It's kind of in the name, so it requires the analyst to reach beyond his or her specialty. So for Professor Kachilla, beyond the scope of weapons of mass destruction and nukes, to consider social, organizational, economic, environmental, technological, political, legal, and global forces that can affect the topic. So pretty much, even though you're not an expert in it, you have to research everything and make sure that you at least have a basic understanding. And then the next category is challenge analysis. The first is pre-mortem analysis. So when to use that should be used by analysts to challenge their own conclusions to see where they might be wrong. It's most effective in a small group. Obviously, if you're by yourself and you're looking at your own research, you're like, yeah, that's fine, it's good. So it's in a small group, you look at your own research and other analysts' research. So the value added, the questions are reframed and it results in responses that are different from the original ones, whether you're forced to reframe them or you do more research and you realize they need to be reframed. And it legitimizes dissent and identifies the weaknesses in previous analysis. Again, just more research, it's going to be more sound arguments. So the method, the best time is shortly after a group has reached a conclusion of an action plan on a certain issue, but before any serious drafting of the report has happened. So the group needs to have a meeting and bring a list of things that might have gone differently than expected. So whether it's you're bringing a list of, well, I disagree with the point you made, but I just didn't want to say it because we were in a time crunch, that's the place to get all that stuff out. The next is structured self-critique. This one I think is probably the hardest one because, again, based off the name, you never want to look at your own research and say, oh, I might be wrong. So when to use it, it's used to look for weaknesses in any analytic explanation or events or estimates of the future. So it can be used as the next step to pre-mortem analysis. This is important as a double check prior to any publication of a major product like the NIE. So before a huge, very important document goes out, you want to look at it and make sure there's no weaknesses and it's solid before you present it to the Department of Defense. So the value added, it changes the frame of reference and is intended to change the group dynamic. They want to get you thinking in a different way about different things. So it's supposed to generate more critical ideas. So team members that had doubts or suppressed questions, like I said, they're encouraged to express these thoughts. So they're saying, if you have a doubt, if you have a question, don't keep it to yourself. Please let us know now so we can discuss it. The method, it works through the following process. So sources of uncertainty, analytic process, critical assumptions, diagnostic evidence, information gaps, missing evidence, anomalous evidence, changes in the broad environment, so if something changes between your last meeting that needs to be brought up, alternative decision models, cultural expertise, and deception, once again, needs to be discussed. So the what-if analysis. So this is alerting decision makers to an event that could happen that may seem unlikely at the time. So something like, well, what if there's a terrorist attack on our home soil in the next month? People can say, okay, well, it's probably not going to happen, but on the off chance it does happen, no one saw 9/11 coming. It can kind of, I don't know, but so if you do more what-if analysis, you can be more prepared for disastrous events of that sort. The next is devil's advocacy. self-explanatory, everyone knows what that is, but it's one person is declared the devil's advocate to make a case against the proposed judgment, and you pretty much have to